In my college, all freshmen had to live in the dorms, and they had to live in either a double or a triple. I was a bit nervous about sharing the room with another person, and this only got even worse when I met the guy to be my roommate. This guy was named Kyle, and Kyle was really weird. He was sort of dark. I don't mean to say he was a goth or anything like that, because that's not really what I mean. I mean, yeah, he did wear dark clothes and had dark makeup as well, but he was just so weird. He took it to a level that was much more than just an odd fashion statement here and there. He was involved with what he believed to be witchcraft, and I'm not just talking about Wicca or that sort of thing. He called the witchcraft he believed in black magic, and very often referred to entities he would pray to, and demons and that sort of thing. Now, I'm not particularly religious or anything, but everything he did just made me really uncomfortable. Things with Kyle were at first just annoying. He would always be awake at all times of night, and I always had to be up early for class the next day. He would sit at this little altar thing he'd made and talk to these demons by candlelight. He kept me awake all throughout the night, so I took to wearing earplugs and an eye mask to try and get at least some sleep. One night, though, I was woken up by a lot of noise that even my earplugs couldn't keep out. When I peeked out from under my mask, Kyle was having a three-way with another girl and guy on his bed. I just put my mask back on and pretended I'd never seen anything. So far, it had only been minor annoyances, but it turned very scary one day. I got home from class, and Kyle, who usually didn't pay much attention to me before, seemed really excited to see me. He told me he was communicating with one of his demons, and he needed someone's blood in order to do this further. He just straight up asked me if he could have some of mine. I turned him down, of course, and he insisted it would not hurt at all. I told him I wasn't really concerned about the pain. I didn't want him to use my blood for some nefarious ritual or something. He just kept on begging for my blood for a while, but I didn't relent at all. When he gave up finally, I could tell he was extremely pissed off at me. I didn't really care though, because at least he left me alone for the rest of the night. As usual that night, I went to bed with my earplugs and my mask on. I'm not sure how long I'd been sleeping before I felt a sudden and sharp pain surge up in my arm. I jumped up in bed, ripping my eye mask off immediately. There was a large slash in my arm, and Kyle was kneeling next to my bed, holding a ceremonial knife. The guy had actually sliced me open and started to collect my blood in my sleep. Enraged, I kicked him in the head, which knocked him down to the floor. I kicked the knife out of his hand and ran out the door. I ran straight to the RAS room and pounded on the door frantically. She answered and saw the huge slash in my arm. She called the campus police. Kyle was arrested soon after, and you can be damn sure I pressed charges against him. I know after he was taken out of my room, and I assume he was removed from the school as well. I don't technically know for sure exactly what happened though. I'm just happy I never saw that psychopath again though. I knew right away I was gonna have problems when I started living in the dorms. Growing up, I'd always had a room of my own, and being with another person was gonna be pretty hard to get used to already. When I first met my new roommate, he was actually a really nice guy. His name was Josh, and we got along really well. Still, it was difficult for me to always have another person hanging around all the time. There was definitely no privacy for me anymore in these small rooms either. About a month after I'd moved in, I was up studying late at night. Josh had been deep asleep for a while, when suddenly he just rose out of his bed like a zombie. He was only wearing his boxers. He got up and walked out of the room in his underwear. He didn't come back for about an hour. I tried to ask him where he'd gone like that, but he ignored me and went back to his bed, sleeping right away. The next day, I brought this up to him, and he told me he used to sleepwalk when he was little. He hadn't done this in a really long time, but had been concerned that he would start up again. He had a feeling it would start up when he went to college and added more stress to his life. He told me it was normally not that big a deal. He'd just walk and wander around for a bit and then head back to bed. He said it would be fine if I wanted to wake him up if I did anything weird. Apparently the rule that you're not supposed to wake up a sleepwalker isn't really true. Over the next few weeks, Josh did sleepwalk a few more times. I did wake him up once or twice when I thought he might get into some trouble. Sometimes, however, I couldn't. He would leave while I was sleeping, and when he came back into the room was generally when I would wake up. Anyway, the sleepwalking really wasn't that big of a deal until one particular night. Like I mentioned, it would almost always just involve him walking around in his boxers, but one night it took a really odd turn. I was deep in sleep when I began to hear some strange noises, which woke me up pretty quickly. I was still groggy and not able to pay that much attention to it until I heard the sound of something hitting the floor. Opening my eyes, I was immediately shocked. Josh had just opened the window and taken the screen off of it. He was climbing onto the windowsill of our second-story dorm room window. I jumped up to try and stop him, but before I could do anything, he fell out of the window as if it were nothing. Freaked out, I ran over and looked down. Josh was lying there in his boxers on the ground. There were a few students outside who had been unlucky enough to witness this. I ran out of the dorm still in just my boxers and sprinted down the stairs. I told the people around him that I was his roommate and that he was a sleepwalker. Fortunately, he survived the fall. Apparently, he landed on his feet, and the shock of the fall completely shattered both of his legs. Josh was okay and didn't remember anything about what had happened, or at least as okay as you can be with two completely shattered legs. I know this might not seem as scary to some of you, but you just need to imagine this picture. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night and seeing your best friend jumping out of a second-story window with no cause, as if it were nothing. I was absolutely terrified. I'm sure you've heard this sort of story 100 times before, but I think this one might be just a little bit weirder than most. Mostly that's because I live in a very rural area, and when this happened, I was in fact living out on a ridge all by myself. I won't give the name of this ridge though. I'd rather keep this strange story anonymous and not allow people to find my location. My house was way up on a hill and was about a 20-minute drive from the next closest house. We had a huge big yard, and on a clear night, you could see just about the entire Milky Way clearly. It was so dark out there, and there were no polluting lights around. Growing up in that house was great, other than that I had to get up nearly 2 hours before school started because the bus needed a long time to get there and back. Other than that, it was pretty nice though. This happened when I was 13 years old. My parents were visiting my grandmother, and I decided not to go with them this time. Usually, I'd get pretty bored when I went there, so I stayed in the house by myself instead. I was curled up on the couch in the living room and watching various horror movies late into the night. At one point, I got a sudden phone call. I didn't think to ask who it was. It was someone who wanted to speak to my father. He didn't ask for my father by name though. He just asked, "Hey, is your dad home?" I stupidly told him no, and that he wouldn't be home for a few days yet. The guy didn't even offer to leave a message and just hung up immediately. I very quickly put the incident out of my mind, but about an hour later, towards the end of a very scary movie, I was startled by a sudden knock at the door. I was even more surprised because I hadn't seen the lights of a car pulling up into the driveway. It would have been very obvious if someone had driven up here. I looked over at the clock and saw it was about 11 p.m. I think anyone, especially someone who lives in a rural area, would be a bit freaked out by someone suddenly coming to knock on the door this late at night. I didn't know how to react. I thought the best idea was to just not answer the door at all. I already had all the lights off, so maybe whoever was out there wouldn't know I was home. I had the remote control on the couch, and I quickly clicked the kill button to kill the light from the television. I hid under the blanket, just in case the guy looked in through the window. When I didn't answer, whoever was outside knocked again. He waited for a few moments. I still didn't answer the second time. When I still didn't respond, the person outside began banging really hard on the door, then started yelling, "I know you're home, and I know you're alone." He kept knocking on the door over and over. You might be wondering, why didn't I call the cops in that moment? Well, remember just how far away I lived. There was no way they would get there in time. I didn't even think about going to get my dad's gun either. I just stayed under those covers, shivering as the man continued pounding on the door. There was no way in hell I was going to answer it, obviously. Eventually, the guy gave up. I heard him knocking some things over on the porch. Then it was all quiet once more. I stayed on the couch covered up and didn't dare turn the television back on either. I mean, I didn't know if the man had gone to another door or window of the house just to hide. I didn't know if he could see inside. If I moved, maybe he would see me. Eventually, after quite a long time had passed, I fell asleep out of exhaustion. I woke up in the morning as the sun began to shine into the room. I felt very relieved a few hours later when the phone started ringing. I was scared to answer it, assuming it would be the same guy again. I had put 2 and 2 together at this point and figured that person must have been the knocker. To my fortune though, the person on the phone was not that man. I answered it and was immediately informed it was the police. An old grandmother who lived a few miles down the road in a lonely house like my own had been attacked and brutally beaten the previous night. It happened only a few hours after the knocker had left my house. They were calling to warn us that whoever did the attacking was still at large and to exercise extreme caution. I just know it was that same man. Now first off, I'm a guy. I have to get that out of the way right away, because this is a story about pet cats, and I know a lot of people assume cats are more of a girl's pet sort of thing. I've always had a great fondness for felines. I mean, they're such beautiful animals. Sure, some of them can act really stuck up sometimes, but hey, they're cats. They have every right to do so. My parents bought me a cat when I was about 10 years old. His name was Greasy, for no better reason than I wanted to name my cat something I was sure no one else would have already done. He's still alive actually, and is sitting next to me as I'm writing this story down. Even though I love my cat, I wanted another one as well. Cats are sort of like tattoos, in the way that you can't only have just one of them. My parents, on the other hand, didn't want me to have more than one pet. I recall around the time I was 12 or 13. One night, Greasy was getting a little more meowy than usual. He was also hanging around the front door. When I went to check out why, I noticed there was a young cat hanging out in the bush in front of our house. Having sympathy for the young creature, as well as just loving young animals in general, because he was a freaking cat especially, I decided I'd feed him a bit. I grabbed one of Greasy's extra bowls and gave the extremely hungry cat outside a small meal. The way I looked at it now was that I now had 2 cats. I named this stray cat Sebastian and even wrote the name on his bowl. I wasn't allowed to bring him into the house obviously, and I didn't tell my parents much about him. I enjoyed my stray cat though. He was awesome, and it was nice having one cat inside and one outside. My parents went to bed early because they often got up early for work. It was really easy to do this without them finding out because of that. I'm not really sure for how long this went on, but I guess it went on for a fairly long time. My parents didn't notice how quickly we were going through cat food, or perhaps they didn't care anyway. I always wished I could let Sebastian into the house, but of course I couldn't do so. Every now and then, Sebastian would eat his food early, then jump up on the window ledge and look inside. Whenever he'd do this, I'd pet him for a while. One night, I was watching some late-night television in the dark when I heard some rustling going on outside near the front door. I figured it was Sebastian looking for his dinner, so I grabbed his bowl and filled it up. When I went outside, however, he was nowhere to be seen. I tried calling out for him in a quiet voice, but he still didn't show up. I guess I stupidly figured he might be hanging out in the bushes. That was silly, simply because there was no reason for him to do that. He would always run towards me for the food. I walked over to the side of the house and nearly fell over in shock when I saw a figure dressed all in black sneaking underneath one of our windows. Shocked, I dropped the food. The man looked over to me. It only took a few moments for our mutual shock to fade and for him to immediately make a rush towards me. Having already dropped the cat food, I twisted around and quickly ran back to the house, screaming for my dad. I got to the door, opened it, and ran inside. I attempted to close it, but the guy shoved his arm in first. He grabbed the door and began trying to pull it open. We struggled back and forth for a moment until suddenly the living room light turned on. When the light turned on, the would-be burglar realized he would be caught. He cut his losses and let go of the door. He jumped off the porch and ran for the hills, so to speak. My dad did call the cops. And to my surprise, the guy was actually caught as well. Sebastian did come back later to get his food too, although I was scared to go outside again. Still though, I put out his meal, and he was a very happy cat that night. Well, telling this story is going to date me a bit, I guess, but this happened when I was about 15 years old. I had been having a pretty severe case of insomnia, and as anyone who has suffered from insomnia knows, you can only lay in bed for so long before you just have to give up and find something to do. To let you know a little bit more about the situation, this happened in the summer. My parents were not home this night, as they had gone to a party. Knowing my father, he had probably gotten so drunk as well that they weren't going to be coming home anytime soon. He was one of those guys to get trashed, then refused to know when it was time to leave. Because of this, I was home all alone. I had actually started to drift off a bit when my body jerked. I'm sure you've had this happen before. It woke me up, and after that, I wasn't able to get back to sleep. I tossed and turned and tossed and turned. Finally, I rolled over and looked at my clock. It was just a couple of minutes before 11:30 p.m. I figured I might as well get up for a bit and watch The Tonight Show. Maybe Johnny Carson would help me relax and put me to sleep. I walked up the hallway and into the living room without turning on any of the lights. I turned the TV on, then flopped down on the couch and stretched out a bit. I watched Johnny and began to feel a whole lot better after the beginning of the show. I went to turn the TV off and apparently got a bit of a static shock. This caused me to pull my hand away from the TV. Because of the suddenness of this action, I turned around, only to see, facing the couch, to my horror, a man hiding on the far side, crouched down in the small space between the wall and the couch. I screamed in shock. The man actually looked pretty surprised himself as well. I quickly sprinted out of the room and into the kitchen. My intent was to grab a knife. I found a big cleaver easily. I flipped the lights on and ran back into the living room to confront the man. The door was wide open, and the man had fled into the night. I called the cops as I did a thorough check of the house with cleaver in hand. The man was definitely gone now. All I could figure is he must have seen my parents' car gone, and the lights were out. He must have thought no one was home and tried to rob us. When he heard me get up, he didn't have time to get out of the house, so he hid in the corner. I don't think he expected me to stay up from insomnia and watch a whole hour of television. The man had been trapped there the entire time I was watching Johnny Carson. The man was right behind me, crouched in my house only a few feet away, and I never knew. I would have never known if I hadn't turned around from that sudden static shock.